Thank you, Professor Yves Robinson-Kruse-Becher, Professor Patrick Welte, and Professor Christoph Wegener for inviting to this exciting workshop on carbon finance. And today I want to speak about financing climate justice, and I want to make the case of taxation, transfers, and green bonds for environmental inclusion solution. So I have to say this comes out of a larger project on mapping climate justice that I've been pursuing since 2016. And overall, the idea was to find creative solutions in order to avert climate change. We can overall say that climate change is happening. As we can see here in this graph, the world surface temperature anomalies from 1880 to 2017, we can see an upwards trend, and especially from 2000 on, we can see really that climate change is happening around the globe. But the climate mapping climate justice project then really paid attention to the disparate impact of climate change, and we can say that three dimensions play into the inequality that is inherent in global warming. On the one hand, mapping climate justice thinks about fairness within a country. Thereby, you can say that certain groups in society have potentially a higher burden to pay for finding fair climate solutions and to finance climate change mitigation and adaptation. Ideas to have a progressive taxation scheme or a consumption tax would help avert that certain parts, minorities, for instance, or low-income households are facing heavier pressure. We can also say from the socioeconomic dynamics that certain gender compositions are potentially female as the caretakers and the household shoppers are facing a higher socio-psychological burden when they are pressured to buy green goods. On a very large scale, we can also make this case that climate, that there would be an intertemporal idea to reap benefits from past wealth accumulation when considering an inheritance tax in the corporate sector when there is a merger and acquisition or a buyout, when there is a peak in productivity, that then potentially enacting a tax that goes to climate change mitigation and adaptation financialization would be an elegant strategy to reap the benefits from past wealth accumulation in the corporate sector that potentially caused some of the climate issues. Then on a larger scale, I think about climate fairness in between the world. And here you can say that different countries have completely different starting grounds on climate, and that naturally leads to different starting grounds on facing a positive or negative impact of climate change in the short run. I will speak more in a minute how to really calculate this by macroeconomic means, but for now I want to say that there's this interesting legal case how you can disown people and from their private property, and this is usually the case when the private property holder is not alive anymore, and you can turn this private property into a common good if a country has better means of protection and conservation. That happens often in international law cases, restitution cases. So for instance, the stone of Rosetta that came originally from Cairo or from Alexandria in Egypt was never restituted. It ended up in London in the National Gallery, and Great Britain makes the case that they have better means of protection and conservation, and they give this stone a meaning and a gestalt because it's exhibited exhibited in a very safe and secure place in a museum, and it gets a gestalt by being with other exponents that really describe the importance and the meaning of this stone. And this argumentation that's often used in international law, that a country can disown people if and turn a former private property into common goods. You could also use for means of protection and conservation arguments when a country faces actually positive impacts of a warming climate, then this country potentially also has a higher responsibility to protect and conserve the earth from the overall problem, climate change, that is on the long run for all countries in the world going to be problematic and having a negative impact. More to come in a second, how to calculate who's winning and who's losing from climate change. And then overall, I also make the case that climate justice in between generations should find a burden sharing strategy in between different generations, and that is often done by climate bonds. And I will present a very tangible solution how to enact climate taxation and bonds in order to create fairness in between countries, but also over generations. So who is winning economically and who's losing from climate change? Overall, you can say that in the world, climate is distributed highly unequally. We all agree that Canada has a cooler mean temperature than, for instance, Mexico. And once you start with this, then you have projections how hot it is going to be until 2100. And you do have in the literature the optimum productivity temperature for the 3 GDP pillars of agriculture, service, and industry sector, which differ throughout the world, of course, as well. So in a more industrialized world, they are usually more focused on service industry, whereas not so developed parts of the world usually rely more heavily on agriculture. So when you have these 3 components, the mean temperature, the optimal temperature for GDP productivity in the 3 pillars of agriculture, service, and industry, and you have the different compositions of agriculture, service, industry, and industry for GDP productivity, then you can calculate at what moment in time what country has the optimal productivity levels to expect in a rising temperature level. And of course, we do not know exactly if 1 degree plus or minus from the optimal condition then is a linear rise or a decline, or a prospect, or a hyperbolic. Here you see in this one graph that I show, which comes from the literature, a hyperbolic assumption around this mean temperature or the top temperature for productivity levels, but because we do not know how this is distributed, I calculated all 3 models and then took the mean in order to pay tribute to the variance there in the assumptions. And then what you can find here is a graph that displays the countries in green that have the longest time ahead until they reach the peak condition, the peak world temperature condition for productivity based on their mean starting ground and their GDP composition based on agriculture, service, and industry. So the green countries have the most time ahead. We see Canada and Russia. The yellow countries are the countries that are around the peak condition in 2100, and the red countries will have run out of time by 2100, by the year 2100. And what you can see here is I also display it in a chart like this. And on the left bar chart, you have 1/3 of the countries that are in the data set in green, 1/3 of the countries in yellow, and 1/3 of the countries in red, so democratically divided. But then when you start dividing it up by 1/3 of the gains, the overall gains that are expected from climate change, you see this green bar really shifts up. So what this means is only a few countries in the world will be gaining a lot until 2100 from global warming, whereas the most of the countries really have a prospect of a declining GDP levels. Overall, I can also already now see in the 181 countries that I have data for here, that the being a climate change winner or loser is positively, significantly correlated with greenhouse gas emissions. So you can say that the countries that have the prospect of gaining more from climate change are also the countries that are actually causing the problem. And we already see climate-induced migration patterns. The countries that have a rising GDP prospect also have migration streams moving into them. And we see climate-induced financial inflows. Also, there is a financial stream into the climate change winning countries. And there's no remittance flow, significant remittance flow back to the losing countries. So you see already now people are moving and finance is moving into the areas that have a rising GDP prospect in light of global warming. And if you want to take one thing away from my presentation, I urge you to take this. I only show these macroeconomic gains and losses from climate change in order to pay attention to the vast inequality that comes with the climate change problem, and of course based and driven by ethical and economic foundations. I want to make the case that there is this ethical and economic need to redistribute some of these gains into the losing areas. We find it in Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative that you can redraw into the climatorial imperative, saying that you should not engage in an action so cause climate change if you do not want to have the negative impacts on climate change. You can also think about Don Rawls' veil of ignorance. You should evaluate every ethical dilemma only behind the veil of ignorance without knowing whether or not you will be gaining or losing from the ethical predicament. Hans Jonas had this extension of Immanuel Kant's thoughts in really also saying that we cannot do harm and not only to each other, but also in relation to the environment. And Professor Dimitri Nicolin's recent chapter on responsibility and hope really speaks about the ethical imperative that is in climate inequality, and we really do have to face the responsibility to protect the earth, no matter what, if we are gaining or losing in the short or in the long run. And Nicolas Caldo's compensation criteria also speak from the economic perspective. If there is inequality, you can alleviate and create a better world by redistribution if everyone agrees to the major problem. And in the COP26, one of the outcomes was this attention to inequality inherent in climate change and this urge and need to redistribute between countries. What I also did is I then calculated 5 indices, and this is where the project these days stands. And I use these climate change winning and losing prospects, but also CO2 emissions in the first index. When you think about who's gaining from climate change and who's emitting, you can see here that the red and the yellow countries of China and the US, but also Russia, seem to cause the climate change problem, but also be more on the favorable side in the short run of climate global warming. And so I I would argue that these countries have a higher responsibility to protect and find the funds in order to redistribute into the areas that are green, and those are the countries that are losing out the most and the fastest from climate change. So you see as pretty much the global south. And here I make this argument that you could have a taxation, a common bond that is housed in one of the global governance institutions like the IMF or the World Bank or the United Nations. And in the red and yellow countries, I would argue that those industries that face a rising GDP prospect, I would argue for a redistribution into these areas in green, and there you could issue out of the taxation of the industries that have a rising GDP prospect, so curb some of the gains in areas that have a prospect to rise. Then you would fund climate bonds in those areas of the world that are green in this world map, and there you could issue bonds that give helicopter money for alleviating the climate change burden, but also for a transition to renewable energy solutions. And the bonds could also be partially financed via debt that has to be paid back by the next generation who gets a stable climate in lieu. Index number 2 then also integrates climate flexibility, which I see as the range of temperatures a country can offer. So you can also say that countries are completely different on the range of different climate zones they can offer, and this is an international trade asset. So they are more flexible. We can all agree that if you can go swimming in a country on a beach, but also skiing, you have more to offer than a country that only offers one flat climate. And when you take this into consideration, when you have this climate change flexibility as future wealth of nations trade aspect, but also this economic gains and loss prospect and CO2 emissions as a cause of climate change, you get pretty much this chart. So again, the red and the yellow and light green countries should be refinancing bond solutions in the green countries. So China, US, but also Russia should be refinancing into the green areas that are losing out the most, that are not very climate flexible, and that have that are not causing the problem because they have low CO2 emission levels. Index number 3 then takes up all these climate change winners and losers, the gain and loss prospect, but also looks into who is causing climate change in CO2 emissions, but also integrates CO2 emission changes over time in order to put a positive market incentive out there. If you are willing to change, then you can change from being a climate change taxation grantor of the bond solution into being a recipient country that gains actually from cutting carbon emissions. Here you see that the red country should still be financing, so using taxation, whereas the green country, and this is the US, that started heavily to de-invest and cut carbon emissions in the last few years. This is, I think, for the year 2019. So you can say that you can see from the previous picture that the US shifted from being a climate change grantor into a recipient of the fund solution in this index solution. The fourth index then also integrates historically grown bank lending rates, and this is as a means to raise funds for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Markets are extraordinarily important, and we can say that some countries simply have better access to finance historically. And here you see the red and the yellow countries should be taxing the climate or should be using taxation in order to fund climate bonds that should be giving to green countries. And the very last piece of index that I want to show you here is an index in which I use the consumption-based trade-related CO2 emissions. So I control for who's actually consuming the goods that are produced via CO2 emissions. And here you see that the China all of a sudden shifts into becoming a recipient of funds, whereas here you see this red country is actually Switzerland, who's consuming, a country that is consuming a lot of CO2, that is or goods whose CO2 emissions in other parts of the world are taken out of the equation. And those are 5 different indices, different starting grounds to start the discussion. Who should be financing a climate change mitigation and adaptation solution in a common taxation and climate bonds strategy? And now I very much look forward to questions and answers, and thanks so much for your attention.